So a couple of days ago we had the Trump-Putin summit, and a lot of fallout, a lot of liberal tears. But I think one of the things that people are struggling to wrap their heads around with it, and one of the reasons that you've had such universal confusion surrounding the summit, is that Trump wasn't himself. He wasn't bombastic, he wasn't commanding the stage. He felt like he was reading off a script. It felt very unnatural. It felt like he was trying to convey certain points and wasn't willing to deviate from this pre-formatted, agreed speech, shall we say. And a lot of people are viewing that in terms of, well, he must be embarrassed, or he must have found he was out of his depth, or, maybe Putin went in there and put his boot on his neck and said, "You're doing whatever I want from here on out." Or maybe he was Putin's lackey all along. But I don't think that's what it is. And this is something that Putin's been saying for a very, very long time. You can go back and look at footage from him year after year after year. And the one thing that he keeps returning to is this concept of balance. Now, over the years, we've had various organisations pop up all over the world. You've had NATO, you've had the European Union, you've had the G7, too many to name, UN Security Council. And the problem with all these things is they're all built around these binding agreements, these ideas, particularly in the case of NATO, of an attack on one is an attack on all. And what you're laying when you put these things in place is a series of potential fault lines that can occur. So, for example, you've got Turkey as a significant member of NATO. NATO, of their forces, America currently contributes about 2.5 million soldiers. Turkey commits 1.5 million, so they are a hugely significant member of NATO. But then you've got the European Union, which is a separate organisation, and what began initially as a market to sell coal and steel amongst a small group of countries has morphed and evolved over time into a political union which is now considering building its own internal military. And Turkey aren't a member of the European Union, and they want to be a member of the European Union, but we obviously don't want them because they're a little bit too volatile. Particularly post-coup, Turkey are not really someone that can be counted on, and the membership of NATO in particular is strange given the fact that they have very close political ties to Russia at the moment. They're very much a country that is sitting in both camps. They're both with the West and with Putin. And once you get to these kind of scenarios where somebody's a member of one group but not another, things become awkward and you create the possibility of friction. You either let them in on both or possibly lose them on either. And I think that's one of the reasons that Trump in particular has been pushing for increased NATO spending, because he quite rightly believes that you can't count on Turkey long term. And if you're suddenly going to lose 25 to 30% of your overall fighting force overnight, that's a pretty big hit to take. And NATO might well be working well as it currently is. We'll get to that later. But that would be a quite a seismic shift within the organisation. And the thing to bear in mind is that NATO, as it originally was not a large organisation. It's grown and grown and grown over the years, adding on new members. And since its original intention was to counter the USSR as a large bloc itself, now that the USSR's gone, and what you really have is Russia and a series of sort of neutral nations in between, it's a tip scale again. And I think to a certain extent this was part of the reasoning behind the annexing of Crimea. Because what NATO ultimately does is it turns the area of Eurasia, if you will, into a board, and you're slowly accumulating pieces on that board, grabbing squares. And obviously Georgia and Ukraine have been the big targets of NATO of late to get them on board. And when you look at the situation in Crimea prior to the annexation, the majority of people identified themselves as Russian. They considered themselves ethnically Russian. They lived their lives as Russians did. And the problem is, once you start that kind of game, then Russia's going to be looking at it and saying, well, these are people who we have a very close tie to. It's a specific section of the country. And we don't want to feel like we're cut off from them. So now we have to take them. Because if we don't take them, you're going to. And if you look at the expansion of NATO over the years, it is spreading, and you can see pockets occur where you've got countries that are essentially surrounded on all sides by NATO members. And it just becomes a question of when rather than if they're going to be swallowed up eventually. And that's dangerous because you're essentially saying join us or you're against us. It's an almost cult mentality. And beyond all the contradictions and the expansionist nature of it, for me that is without question the single most amusing thing about it is the fact that you've got all these social justice warriors screeching about Trump letting down NATO when in reality NATO is a clandestine modern take on imperialism to a certain extent. But the real kicker, the real thing that I struggle with when it comes to these kind of organisations is that they self-justify. And I think one of the reasons Trump was so not himself when he came out and he gave that speech is I think he got to look behind the curtain for the first time in a very long time. I think Putin wanted a private meeting with him so he could show him what's really going on and see how he reacted. And you look back at certain things that have occurred over the years. I mean, the whole situation in Ukraine, and you had several high-ranking members of the US government going in and getting involved in various political machinations that led to a changing of the guard, shall we say. People who were more loyal to the US. And even Montenegro, you had the coup attempt. CIA's had its dirty little fingers in many a revolution over the years. And you begin to wonder whether Russia has really been as aggressive as it's been portrayed, or whether the CIA has stepped in and created this illusion. And they've bumped off many governments over the years around the world. We all know that. Drop a team of guys into the middle of an urban area that's going through particular economic problems. Find a local social issue, get a load of people riled up, protesting, clashing with police, single bullet fired into a crowd from a sniper. Boom. It spreads like cancer and turns the tides of countries. I have no doubt whatsoever that America was involved with the situation in Tahrir Square. The movement over from Mubarak to ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood. You swapped one dictator for another, but it was a dictator that the powers that be wanted. And that's the problem with all these organizations. You can say, well, we're joining for our own security and protection and all these benefits and so on and so forth, but you're becoming a vassal state to the most significant member or members. NATO, ultimately America calls the shots. I mean, look at the situation with the European nations at the moment basically running around shitting their pants because they might get their funding for their defence taken away. They might actually have to stand up on their own 2 feet and defend their own nations. Makes them soft. You can rely way too much on other people fighting your battles for you. And then you've got no reason to develop these capabilities for yourself. What happens if you ever really did get that quote-unquote fascist leader that the Americans, well, half of Americans believe that is currently occupying the White House? What if you get an American leader that says, well, you know what, we're done with you, we're going to go and pally up with China? What happens then? You can't be reliant on the rest of the world to look after your problems. And that's one of the reasons that socialism and, you know, the welfare state and all these kind of things have grown in Europe like a cancer, because when you can rely entirely on somebody else to take care of all your problems, then you become very self-indulgent. You become very soft. You know, Europe had its problems before the EU came along. You know, there was don't even get me started. There were many wars and all this sort of stuff. But the other thing to consider is that a lot of those wars were between two nations. You know, obviously, other than the main two, obviously. But they were small, self-contained conflicts. Rather than this idea of let's stack all these nations together like fucking top trumps. There was no concept of, you know, the spark that could end the world. And that's what's happening now. I mean, you know, you can't say, I don't want nuclear weapons, but I do want NATO, because both of them are essentially building towards a form of nuclear holocaust to a certain extent. I mean, you know, if the combined forces of NATO ever went over and took on China and Russia, there won't be much of a world left after that. And that's the other issue that you have with organisations like NATO, is because they ultimately will grow and grow and grow and grow. All you're doing is you're forcing Russia into a position where it has to form binding agreements with China. It has to get very pally with them because it needs to form some kind of counter. You're forcing one side claims to be increasing its own defensive capabilities, but you know, adding a couple of thousand rifles is adding a couple of thousand rifles on the battlefield. You're going to need something to counter that. And that's all you're ultimately doing with these kind of scenarios, is you're divvying up the world and saying, well, this is our group and this is your group. And as our group goes bigger and bigger and bigger, there's going to come a point where your group is looking small and pathetic and will never gain any form of opportunity to push back. And what do you do then? Well, you figure, fuck it, if I'm going to get wiped out, I might as well wipe everybody out. Let's hit the button. It's a tinderbox. Not even just that. I mean, you know, you get some small nation that has a particularly tense relationship with its neighbour, that doesn't happen to be a NATO member, and next thing you know, you're dragging all these people in that have no reason to be there. That in turn will force the host nation into the arms of your enemy, splitting the world down the middle. No different to what the progressives are doing. I mean, you look at the term people of colour. That is specifically designed to say, right, we are all part of a collective because we're all small groups, and we figure if we band together and we can draw in enough, much like the sort of LGBTQ thing as well. I mean, it's about taking small disparate groups and saying, well, no, we have collective power against you. But what begins as, well, you know, we are these sort of small oppressed groups, and as you grow and you grow, can you still claim to have the same degree of oppression? Can you still claim to be building this coalition as defence when you outnumber the thing that you're supposed to be defending against quite significantly? I mean, you know, in terms of military capabilities, ever since the founding of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, America has set up its military in such a way that it could take on its two largest competitors, i.e. Russia and China. America doesn't need Europe. It can fight its own battles. It is the dominant military force on the face of the planet. So what you have is a situation where Europe needs America. It's a vassal state. Just as the situation is within the European Union, the original core 6 countries, the inner 6, essentially run the European Union to a certain extent. I mean, you know, countries like Poland, they pump a shed load of money into them, make them utterly reliant upon the European Union. And they get it into their heads, oh, well, we can't leave because what about all these subsidies? What they never consider, why are they paying to bring you in? They're paying to bring you in because they can get you to generate cheap manufacturing for them. German car industry is relying on it. But because of the top-down nature of these kind of organisations, you get locked into this mindset of master-servant relationship. You know, we're living on handouts, much like those living on welfare. It's a broken dynamic, and it needs to change. And this is one of the things Trump has been saying from the outset, is bilateral deals. He wasn't just talking about trade, he was talking about the way the world order works in general to a certain extent. He wants to go back to an idea of cooperation rather than treaties, not locking people in. Because as soon as you do that, you can't ever get away from this tinderbox that could set the whole world on fire. If he pulls this off, and I think he will, because I mean, you know, one of the first things he did was put one of his most trusted guys into the CIA, and now with the information that I've no doubt he's been given by Putin, he knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows what he's got to unpick to a certain extent. But yeah, NATO overall bad thing. Now, I'm not saying you need to go crashing out of it and just dissolve it overnight and what have you, but you need to be working away from this escalation, because all you're doing is carving up a map. And every time a group of supposedly smart men has gotten together and decided to carve up the map of Europe, for example, and the Middle East, well, we know how that turns out. Leave people to self-govern. Let them form their own cultures, their own societies, their own ideas of what it is to be a part of that grouping. Let nations be nations again. Let people go to war when they are threatened, not over politics or oil. There's a reset coming. And anybody who claims to be for world peace while supporting an organisation whose sole purpose is to perpetuate a Cold War that died a long time ago, you need to reassess your values. So I'm done.